There's a stat nobody talks about. Not because it's classified, not because it's hard to find, but because it's uncomfortable in a specific way. The way things are uncomfortable when they're true and nobody wants to say them out loud. The average man hits 35 and feels behind. Not broke necessarily, not sick, not alone, not in crisis, just behind. Like everyone else received a manual at some point, and his copy never arrived. Like there's a version of his life happening somewhere slightly ahead of where he actually is, and no matter how fast he moves, the gap doesn't close. You know what's strange about this? We were told exactly what to do: study hard, get the degree, find a job, work your way up, build the life. Follow the path, be responsible, be consistent, show up. And most of us did. Not perfectly, nobody does anything perfectly, but genuinely. We tried, we followed the instructions, and here we are anyway, 35 or 38 or 42, staring at a life that has good things in it, real things, things worth being grateful for. And also this background feeling, persistent, difficult to name, that something got missed somewhere along the way. I want to talk about that feeling, not to fix it. I'm skeptical of videos that promise to fix things in 30 minutes, but to look at it clearly, to understand where it actually comes from, and to offer something that has been genuinely useful to me, which is a way of thinking about it that Epictetus, a man who by every external measure had it far worse than any of us, figured out 2,000 years ago. If something in that description landed, if the behind feeling is familiar, stay with me. Before I get to the philosophy, I want to spend some time describing the experience accurately, because I think it's often mislabeled, called depression or midlife crisis or ingratitude, in ways that miss what it actually is. The feeling of being lost in your 30s doesn't usually look dramatic from the outside. You get up, you go to work, or you work from home, or you're building something. You take care of your responsibilities. You're present enough. Nobody looking at your life from the outside would necessarily see anything wrong. But there's an internal texture to the days that is hard to describe to someone who hasn't felt it. A kind of flatness. Not sadness exactly, though sometimes that too. More like a muffled quality to everything. Like you're doing the things you're supposed to do, and the things are getting done, and there's nothing technically wrong, and yet some connection between the action and the meaning of the action has gone slightly loose. You do the work, but you're not sure what it's for in the largest sense. You're in the relationship, but you wonder sometimes if you're really in it or just going through familiar motions. You're with your friends, but something in the conversation feels like a performance of the friendship more than the friendship itself. This is the behind feeling, more specifically. It's not that things are bad, it's that things don't feel as connected to something real as they once did. Or maybe as you hoped they would by now. And into that gap, that space between the life you're living and the sense that it should feel more meaningful, comparison pours. The friend who seems to have it together, the colleague who got the promotion, the person from your past who appears on social media to have arrived somewhere. The cultural messaging that tells you what a successful life at your age should look like, which is almost certainly different from what your life actually looks like. And the combination, the internal flatness plus the external comparison, produces this specific feeling. Not failure, not crisis, just this persistent low level sense of being behind, of having missed something. I want to be honest about my own version of this. I'm 38. I'm a father. I've built my income entirely online, from scratch, through years of trial and error. I have a spine injury that's been with me long enough that I've stopped expecting it to simply go away. I live in a small town in Hungary, and there are mornings, real mornings, not hypothetical ones, where I wake up and the first conscious thought is something like, I should be further along than this. Not in a dramatic, collapsed way, just as a background presence. The gap between where I am and where some internal image of where I should be by now says I ought to be. I've learned to recognize that thought, to see it for what it is, but it still appears. The philosophy doesn't make it disappear. It gives you something to do with it when it arrives. And that, the something to do, is what I want to talk about. Let me tell you about Epictetus. Not the summary version, the actual version. Because I think the details matter here in a way they don't always in philosophical discussions. Epictetus was born around 50 AD in Hierapolis, which is in modern Turkey. He was born into slavery, not as a consequence of anything he did, not as a result of any failure on his part. He was born owned. The circumstances of his existence were determined before he drew his first breath by a system he had no hand in creating. His owner, eventually, was a man named Epaphroditus, a freedman who had himself been a slave of Emperor Nero and who had accumulated power and wealth through proximity to imperial authority. Epaphroditus was known, in the historical record, as someone who was not gentle with the people under his control. There's a story, probably historical, possibly embellished, but consistently repeated, about Epaphroditus and Epictetus's leg. The owner was twisting the leg, deliberately, either as punishment or simply as a demonstration of power, the kind of thing that is done when you want someone to understand that their body is not their own. Epictetus, reportedly, said calmly, "You're going to break it." The leg broke. Epictetus said, "Didn't I tell you?" No rage, no pleading, no collapse into victimhood or despair, just a calm observation about what was happening and what would happen. I want to stay with how strange that sounds to a modern ear, because I think we tend to move past it too quickly when we read it. Our first instinct is probably one of two things. Either, this is admirable, this is the ideal, or this is dissociation. This is someone who has been so broken by their circumstances that they've detached from their own pain. I don't think it's either of those things. I think what Epictetus demonstrated in that moment, and what he spent the rest of his life teaching, was a genuine and hard-won distinction between two things that we normally experience as fused together: what is happening to you and what you are. His leg could be broken. His circumstances could be entirely outside his control. His daily life, where he went, what he did, whom he served, could be determined by someone else. But his judgment, his response to events, his interpretation of what was happening and what it meant, his relationship to his own existence, that remained his, not by default, not automatically, but through what must have been enormous, continuous, daily internal work. And his core philosophical teaching, the thing he repeated to students for decades, the thing his student Arian compiled into what we now call the Enchiridion and the discourses, was essentially this: there are things in your control, and things not in your control. The things in your control, your opinions, your desires, your responses, your values, your effort, the direction of your attention. The things not in your control, your body's condition, your reputation, what other people think of you, the economy, the housing market, whether it rains, what your boss decides, what your past looked like. Everything that causes you genuine suffering, he argued, comes from confusing these two categories, from treating things in the second category as if they belong in the first, from spending your energy on what you cannot change while neglecting what you can. And when you actually sit with this distinction, not just understand it intellectually, but sit with it, you realize how much of the lost feeling I was describing comes from exactly this confusion. The feeling of being behind, that's comparing yourself to an external standard you didn't create and largely can't control. The flatness I described often comes from directing energy toward things that won't move: the economy, other people's choices, the past. while the things that could be moved stay still. The background sense that something got missed, often a collision between what you expected life to look like by now, based on external templates, and what it actually looks like, which is always more complicated and more personal than any template. None of these are problems Epictetus would have seen as primarily external. All of them are problems with the direction of attention and energy. I want to be clear about what the dichotomy of control doesn't mean, because it's consistently misread. It doesn't mean that external circumstances don't matter. They do. Epictetus was a slave. External circumstances mattered enormously in the most immediate and physical way possible. It doesn't mean that you should accept injustice passively. Epictetus advocated for nothing of the sort. He lived in a deeply unjust system, and he navigated it with his integrity intact. And it doesn't mean that emotions don't exist, or shouldn't. The Stoics were not trying to become machines. Marcus Aurelius grieved real losses. Epictetus expressed real feelings. The philosophy is not about emotional suppression. What it does mean is this: your internal state, your peace, your stability, your sense of yourself, should not be determined by things you cannot control. That's the claim. And it's radical if you actually follow it. Because most of us have built our internal life on exactly the things we can't control. Our sense of doing okay depends on the job being stable. Our sense of being enough depends on other people's assessment of us. Our feeling of being on track depends on comparison to external benchmarks that are moving targets set by people with no particular knowledge of or interest in our specific life. So when those external things shift, and they always shift, life guarantees it, the internal life shifts with them, automatically, immediately, without our consent. Epictetus is saying it doesn't have to work that way. Not that you achieve some state where nothing touches you, but that you can build an internal life on things that are actually yours, your values, your effort, your response to what happens, and find that those things are more stable than the external ones. This is the work of a lifetime. I am not suggesting it's easy or quick, but it's the direction Epictetus pointed, and I found it genuinely useful. Let me talk about something nobody talks about honestly. Blame feels good. Not in a crude, obvious way, not in a way you'd admit in polite company, but in a very real psychological way. Blame, placing the cause of your situation outside yourself, provides something valuable. It protects the self-image. If the reason things haven't gone the way you wanted is someone else's fault, or the system's fault, or bad timing, or circumstances beyond your control, then your own choices, your own patterns, your own contribution to the outcome remain intact, unexamined, safe. And in your 20s, this protection is almost universal. Bad family situation? Their fault, and often genuinely so. Bad job? Economy's fault, and often genuinely true. Bad relationship? They didn't understand you, they weren't right for you, they changed. Failed venture? Wrong partner, wrong timing, wrong city, wrong moment. I did all of this. Every version of it. And I want to be careful here because some of those explanations were partially true. The economy does affect job prospects. Partners do sometimes fail relationships. Bad timing is real. The problem is not the explanations. The problem is what the explanations prevent. Because as long as the primary cause of your situation is external, as long as the story you tell is primarily one of circumstances outside your control, you can't actually see your own contribution clearly. And your own contribution is the only part of the story you have any power to change. I blame my friend for the restaurant failing, for years, with real conviction. And some of what I blamed him for was probably true. Decisions were made on his side that contributed to the failure. I'm not saying otherwise. But here's what I wasn't saying, for years, because saying it was uncomfortable. I chose to start that business. Not under duress, not because I had no options. I chose it. I chose that partner for that business. Not randomly, I chose someone whose judgment I thought I could trust, without apparently thinking carefully enough about whether our working relationship would survive pressure. I chose not to put a proper legal agreement in place, because we trusted each other, because it felt transactional and we were friends, because creating the formal structure would have required acknowledging that things might go wrong, and I didn't want to acknowledge that. I chose to keep going when the early signs were bad. Not because I was stupid, because I wanted it to work. And wanting something to work is a powerful filter on information that suggests it won't. I chose silence at multiple points where a direct conversation might have changed things, because I didn't want the conflict, because I preferred to believe things would improve on their own. Every one of those is a decision I made. And the version of the story where the primary cause of the failure was someone else's behavior, that story made me feel better about those decisions. It allowed them to remain unexamined. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He was the most powerful man in the world when he wrote that. Emperor of Rome, commander of armies, and he was still, every morning, in his private journal, reminding himself of this. Because even at the top of every conceivable external hierarchy, the internal work is the same. You are still the common denominator in your own life. Not always in a dramatic, all-encompassing way, sometimes in small ways that are easy to overlook. The patterns you bring to situations, the things you avoid seeing, the choices that feel like non-choices because you made them quickly or automatically. The brutal truth, the one nobody told me at 25, the one I had to find my way to slowly and not by choice, is this. You are responsible for your life. Not exclusively, not without acknowledging what was genuinely outside your control, but substantially, in the ways that matter for what comes next. And that responsibility, once you actually accept it, fully, without reservation, is the most empowering thing in the world. Because it means the next chapter is yours to write. Not because the external circumstances will cooperate, they may not, but because you're no longer waiting for them to. I have a whiteboard in my room. One sentence. It's been there for over 2 years. Only what you can change. I see it every morning, and every morning I have to actively use it, because the default, the setting I revert to if I'm not deliberate, is to focus outward. Let me describe what outward focus actually looks like in a day. You wake up, and within 10 minutes you're aware of the economy. Not because you checked a financial report, because you glanced at a screen and something caught your eye. And now there's a background awareness of something large and threatening and entirely outside your ability to influence. You hear about something a colleague received, a promotion, an opportunity, a piece of recognition that you didn't. You spend 20 minutes in a state of low-level resentment about this. The resentment feels justified. It doesn't produce anything. You see what your ex is doing now, or what an old friend has built, or what someone from your graduating class has achieved. You run a comparison that you lose immediately and thoroughly, and you carry the result around for the rest of the morning. You watch the news, or you read commentary about the news, or you engage with someone online who has a take you disagree with. Real energy, cognitive, emotional, physical, goes into this engagement. The thing you engaged with doesn't change. None of these are unusual experiences. They're Tuesday. And what they have in common is this. Every single one of them is energy spent on things entirely outside your control. The economy, your colleague's trajectory, your ex's choices, the news cycle, other people's opinions. You cannot move any of these things. Not 1 cent of the economy. Not 1 pixel of what your ex posts. Not 1 word of how the news unfolds. And so all of that energy, the resentment, the comparison, the anxiety, the engagement, doesn't produce anything. It consumes something. The thing it consumes is the energy that could go toward what you actually can change. This is the hidden cost of outward focus. Not dramatic, not obvious. Just a steady daily leak of the resource that actually matters. Epictetus was specific about what this costs. He wrote, "Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life." He's not saying, be passive, be unmotivated, want nothing. He's saying, stop spending energy fighting what has already happened or what you cannot change, because that fight is unwinnable, and every hour you spend fighting it is an hour taken from the things that are actually in your hands. The whiteboard in my room is a daily reminder of this distinction. Not because I've mastered it, I haven't, but because the reminder is the practice. Marcus Aurelius wrote the same ideas in his journal, in slightly different words, again and again over decades. Not because he figured it out once and needed a reminder, because the returning is the work, every day. You notice you've drifted toward the noise. You return. You notice again. You return again. That's all it is. But accumulated over months and years, it changes something about how your energy is distributed. And where your energy goes, your life follows. I want to return to the restaurant because I think it's the most useful, concrete illustration of everything I've been describing. My best friend and I had known each other for years before we went into business together. Real friendship, the kind where you've seen each other in bad states, where you don't perform for each other, where there's real history and real trust. We decided to open a restaurant, hospitality. We both had some relevant experience, not comprehensive, not professional, but enough that we believed we understood the industry better than we did. We were excited. We were confident. We had the specific confidence of people who have not yet discovered the specific things they don't know. We also believed, and this is the part I think about most now, that the friendship was enough. That trust between friends would substitute for the kind of formal structure that strangers in business together would need. That because we knew each other, we didn't need to spend time mapping out exactly what would happen if things went wrong. This was wrong. Not because the friendship wasn't real, it was, but because friendship and business partnership are different relationships that activate different parts of people, and the overlap is smaller than you hope. The business failed within the year. The details are less important than the dynamic. Things went wrong in multiple directions. Decisions were made by both of us that contributed to the outcome. And the failure under pressure did what failure under pressure often does. It brought out the worst version of both of us. There were accusations, blame in both directions, a silence that started as a pause and became permanent. For a long time afterward, much longer than I'm comfortable admitting, I told the story in a way where the primary cause of the failure was his behavior, his decisions, his failures to come through. That story was not entirely false. He did make decisions that contributed to the failure. I believed that then, and I believe it now. But it was also strategically incomplete. Because every time I told that version, to myself most importantly, I was also protecting something. The part of the story where my choices led here, where my judgment failed, where my decisions, made by me, produced consequences I didn't want. And the protection felt good. The victim version of any story always provides a specific kind of comfort. But it was also, and this is the thing Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius both point at in different words, a trap. Because the version of the story where it was primarily his fault left me with no agency. If the primary cause was outside me, then I was helpless in the face of future situations, future business ventures, future friendships under pressure, future moments where things go wrong. I had no more information about how to navigate those than I started with. The honest version of the story, the one I eventually had to tell myself, uncomfortable as it was, gave me agency. Because it included my choices. And my choices are the only part of any story I can actually do something about. I chose to go into business without a proper agreement because I didn't want to have an uncomfortable conversation about what would happen if things went wrong. That's a pattern, one I can recognize and address. I chose to continue past the point where the signs were clearly bad because I wanted the thing to work more than I wanted to see clearly. That's a pattern too. I chose silence at several points where a direct conversation might have changed things, because I prefer the discomfort of the situation to the discomfort of the confrontation. Also a pattern. None of these are character flaws that condemn me to repeat them, but I had to see them first. And seeing them required telling the honest version of the story. That's what it cost me to get the lesson. A friendship, a business, and a few years of telling myself a more comfortable story than the true one. I'm not saying the lesson was worth the cost. I'm saying the cost was paid. And the choice was whether to take the lesson or not. Here's where it gets practical. Every day you make hundreds of small decisions. Most of them don't feel like decisions at all. They feel like default behaviors, like the path of least resistance, like just what happens. They're not. Every one of them is a choice, and they accumulate. Do you get up when the alarm goes off, or do you negotiate with yourself for another 30 minutes? That's a decision. About whether you're governing your behavior or your comfort is. Do you reach for the phone before your eyes are fully open, or do you let the first minutes of the day belong to you? Decision. About whether the day starts on your terms or someone else's. Do you move your body today, even just a walk around the block? Or do you tell yourself you'll start properly on Monday? Decision. About whether the gap between who you are and who you want to be narrows or stays. On the weekend, do you drink because you genuinely want to, as a celebration or a social pleasure? Or do you drink because the week broke something and alcohol is the fastest way to turn the volume down? Decision. One that gets harder to make clearly if you don't make it consciously. I'm not asking this rhetorically. I'm asking because for a long time, for me, several of those answers were the wrong ones. Not dramatically, I wasn't in crisis, just consistently choosing the easier thing. The thing that felt like relief in the moment and cost me something in the longer run. Epictetus said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." Not who you want to appear to be, not what would look good from the outside, what you would actually be, in the version of yourself that you respect, and then act accordingly. Not once, not in the dramatic moments where it's obvious, in the small ones, the ones nobody sees. Those small decisions, accumulated over months and years, become the answer to the question, who am I? Not the intention, not the aspiration, the daily choice. Your 20s are rehearsal. I know that's not how it feels when you're in them. Everything feels urgent and permanent and consequential. But most of it is rehearsal. You're trying on careers and relationships and versions of yourself. You're accumulating experience, some useful, some not, and beginning to understand slowly what you actually care about versus what you thought you cared about. Your 30s are when the results of the rehearsal show up. The patterns you built in your 20s, the ways you avoid things, the places you blame, the easy dopamine, the relationships you kept out of habit, the work you stayed in because changing felt uncertain. All of it becomes louder, more visible, more obviously connected to the quality of your actual life. And most men have no framework for this. Nobody taught us. The culture offers two options: grind harder or fall apart. Work more and the feeling will go away, or accept that you're stuck and stop expecting more. The Stoics had a third option: Look clearly at what is and isn't in your control. Fully accept the second category, not passively, but genuinely. Stop fighting it, stop resenting it, stop letting it occupy your energy. And then direct everything, all of it, toward the first category. Your choices, your patterns, your daily decisions, your response to what happens, the direction of your attention. That's not passivity. It's the most aggressive approach to life available because it stops the leak, the constant drain of energy toward unmovable things, and redirects it toward the only things that actually move. Nobody is coming to save you. I say that with respect. With the particular respect of someone who spent years waiting, in various ways, for something external to shift and fix what was internal. Your employer won't, the market won't, the government won't. Your partner can support you, a good one will, genuinely, but they cannot do the internal work for you. Neither can any therapist, any friend, any YouTube channel, including this one. At some point, maybe it's today, maybe it was years ago and you haven't quite faced it yet, you have to look at your life and say, this is mine, all of it. The parts that are working and the parts that are wreckage, both. And then decide what to do next. Marcus Aurelius had an entire empire, plagues, wars, betrayal from people he trusted, and every morning he wrote in his journal, not for publication, not for anyone else, reminding himself of the same ideas. He wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. Not perfect, not finished, not waiting for the conditions to be right or the circumstances to cooperate. Just be one. Today, with what you have, where you are." I'm 38. My spine argues with me every morning. I'm building things while my kids sleep. I still make mistakes. I still catch myself blaming the wrong things. I still feel the comparison sting more often than I'd like. But I know the difference now between what I can change and what I can't, between where my energy belongs and where it doesn't. And that distinction, honestly and actually lived, changes everything. Leave a comment. Tell me where you are right now. Not the polished version, the real one. I read everything. See you in the next one.